got the username and password, I then I updated it to make sure nothing was wrong with it, make sure that everything ran smoothly. And the wiki server was mainly used for everyone's documentation. You may be wondering, which operating system? Spoilers, I use Ubuntu. I used Ubuntu 22.4 solely for the purposes of compatibility, stability, as well as a lot of our servers use Ubuntu, so it is more familiar. As for the web software, which one did I use? I chose Apache solely for the purposes of it was simpler than other resources that I had looked at. As for installing Apache, it was much simpler than I thought. So on the web server, after I installed Ubuntu, I then installed Apache, which basically installed Apache, updated the server once again. I then restarted Apache, and I restarted the server to make sure everything was going well and smooth. Now on to Grab. No, it does not have anything to do with gravity, surprisingly. What is Grab? Grab is a content management system, which is a simpler way to operate websites, much more than sitting with a file and creating it up all by code. Why did I choose Grab? Well, compared to Drupal and WordPress, it was a much simpler user interface, as well as it looked more appealing. I then installed Grab. First thing I did was I checked the PHP version. I believe you need a 7.2 or higher to install Grab based on the recommendation page of Grab. After I installed it, after I checked the PHP version, I then installed Grab. I then ran updates again. Never have too many updates. Then once it is installed and everything is configured, you should be able to get to the web again. As for security updates, I use Qualys' SSL Labs based on our instructor's recommendation, as well as it seemed very simple and user-friendly. Now, why did I choose SSL Labs? Again, for simplicity reasons, as well as I found it very interesting, the fact that you could put in any URL and it will give you a letter grade based on security, trust, so on and so forth. And this grade was previously a B. I got it to an A by using Mozilla Web Configuration. Mozilla Web Configuration is really interesting because obviously you put in Mozilla Web Configuration in Google, and then when you click the link, it gives you a list of operating systems that your server could use. For example, I chose Apache, and then I scroll to the bottom, and it gave you a list of a file that you can put into the Apache config file, which is what I did, which then got this to an A. Any questions about the web server or the wiki server?
So on the wiki server, I'm assuming the intent is to use that for documentation.
Yes.
And so the common theme over the last few years has always been new group comes in, has to rebuild everything from scratch because there's no documentation or they can't follow it or find it. So what's this group's idea is to improve upon that so the next group that comes in doesn't have to start from scratch.
Which frankly, I'm getting tired of hearing it.
The only real comment I put down about it was under Grab was, what's the business case for having created anything? That was, you mentioned the documentation, stuff like that. Multi-year is really the key, having been here last year and this year. You guys have all mentioned, the need for that documentation across cohorts. So
things in little by little, if that makes sense. So we would each give brief summaries of what we did and how we did it. Any other questions?
So you used Ubuntu, you used Apache. What methodology now and going forward are you looking at for Apache?
Interesting question. So,
Because it's easy to install this stuff. The hard part is maintaining it. So I'm curious of what your thoughts were about that.
of course, so
Is that something that just wasn't covered as part of web
No.
server, or is it gonna be discussed later, or?
it is most likely going to be discussed later as it is a bit out of scope for now. Any other questions? Alright, with that, I will go with Daniel because that's the last one answer.
Alright, hello, my name is Daniel, and my project was setting up a centralized logging server. Now, with the initial thought process for this, it was what kind of logging servers are out there, and why did I go with what I did? Well, two examples that I have for you here are Graylog, which is a free open source centralized logging service, and the ever popular Splunk, which is a paid option. Now, I went with Graylog because, aforementioned, it is free, but also my instructor has experience with setting up Graylog itself, so having that was kind of nice. And at the same time, it requires a little bit more setup, and while we do have classes over things like Linux, it was nice to be able to do some more with that, and setting up more servers. We didn't go through setting up a centralized logging server, for instance, so it was a good opportunity. Now, Graylog is made up of 4 components. We have a Linux distribution. In this case, it can be something Debian-like with Ubuntu, or something Red Hat-like with something like Rocky Linux. It requires a database and a search tool because it doesn't have those things inherently. And then we need Graylog itself. Now, I went with Ubuntu 22.04 because it has long-term stability as well as it's popular, and so finding assistance with the setup process, or if you find issues or hang-ups, there's a lot of help there. As well as, in terms of long-term support, it has reliable support and security updates. For the database, Graylog requires MongoDB, and its setup process is really simple. You get the repo that has its correct version that you need. In this case, we need version 6, and then we install that version. Next, we need our search tool, and with Graylog, there are 2 search tools that you can use. One is Elasticsearch, and one is OpenSearch. And I went with OpenSearch because if you look at the documentation, it supports an older version of Elasticsearch, and it supports a lot more newer versions of OpenSearch, as well as a couple of older versions. In fact, I think it was about a week ago, they updated their documentation for the newest version of OpenSearch. And the setup for OpenSearch is similar to the database. We get the right repository that has the version that we want, and then we install the correct version. After that, we can configure OpenSearch. Up here is one of the configurations where this here and this here are the minimum and maximum memory that it can use that's on the system. And I gave that half of the memory of the server itself, which is recommended. Down here, some more general things like your cluster name. Now, this is a single node setup, so it doesn't have multiple logging servers, but yeah. And then the node name is just the host name of the server, itself. Path for data and logs, the network host. Discovery type is single node because, as I mentioned before, this is a single node setup. After that, we can get Graylog. Now, beyond needing the database and the search tool, it also requires 2 hashes that you generate. Otherwise, you can't start the service. One of those is this root password hashing algorithm 2 part, And then another one is a password that you decide upon, and then you create a hash for that, and then you put that here in the server config file. And at this point, you can start the service, but if you want to connect to Graylog's web UI, then you have to set your HTTP bind address, which will just be the address of the server and the port by which you're going to access it. And once you've done that, you could go to something like Google Chrome, and you can either use the domain name or the IP address and the port that it has, and it'll take you to this splash screen here. And you'll log in here with the password that you generated, and once you've done that, you'll get to another splash screen where you can start creating inputs. And these inputs are what Graylog is going to listen on for logs from your various devices that you set up. And these inputs can come from various devices. You know, things like your end device computers from Windows devices, Mac OS, different Linux distributions. It could be from printers, wireless access points, and things of that nature. Oh, and your networking equipment, excuse me. Here's some examples of what the input process looks like and what it looks like after the fact. Over here on the left, we have what the name of it is, what the address of that device is, and the port it's going to send the logs to. And this is what they sort of look like after the fact. Now, the top one here is one of our core switches, and this is a Nextcloud Ubuntu server that we have. And so when you have this set up, you would go to the particular devices themselves and have them send logs pointed at the server itself. So for instance, with the core switch here, you would get onto the switch, you would turn logging on, you would use logging, the IP address of the server itself. It will take you into a mode, you use port, whatever port you're going to have these logs sent through, and it will start sending logs. For the Ubuntu server, for instance, is different, where you're going to get onto the server itself, and then you're going to turn rsyslog on, you're going to enable it, you're going to create a config file that, and essentially there's just the one string you're going to put in there, and it'll determine whether you're going to use TCP or UDP, and then what the address of the server is, and the port, again, that is going to send the logs through. Now, once you've started getting the logs in, you can create various dashboards. It creates one for you initially called sources, but you can create multiples. And here's some examples of what you can have the dashboard present to you with the logs that you get. Like on the left side here, it's your volume of logs at which time, or over time I should say. And then on the right here, it's your devices and how much logs are generated by them specifically. And this section here is the sources that it's covering. So if you wanted to break it up by, say like network devices, printers, what have you, or if you wanted it by department, you could do that and it would just track specific things. And lastly, I would like to talk about future plans. So initially, the scope for this project was to get inputs from the various devices in our network, create a dashboard and show the graphical interface for it, and then to secure it all. And I got hung up on something that I'm still currently working on, which is getting Windows to actually send logs that Graylog will take. Windows creates different kinds of logs, and to get something that Graylog will work with, it uses something called WinLogB. And you also have to, on your Windows machine, basically download and execute Graylog Sidecar, and what it will do is it will take these messages and make them into things that Graylog can deal with. Now, the issue that I've run into is that WinLogB has a configuration file of its own, and I've tried a couple of things, and I just haven't quite found what will actually get it to send those logs successfully. So unfortunately, I've been hung up on that. I have done a little bit of research about how to secure Graylog after the fact of all of this, but I'm not exactly sure about how to do that completely. In the documentation for Graylog, the securing it using HTTPS and TLS and certificates, and it also talks about using a reverse proxy, but I'm not quite sure how that setup is done. And with that, are there any questions?
So, two questions.
Yes.
One kind of determine the second. Great technical summary on the syslog server. What was the use case to the larger project, the business case to the larger project for the syslog server? What are you logging in there? So that's kind of the second question. what are you listening to and why?
So things like when people access a device for login, success or failure on that end, to whom would do that sort of thing? Is it something where that would be considered normal, getting logs of that nature? For instance, with the Cisco devices, you can kind of set up the level of severity that it will send logs, and so depending on what you actually want it to do, if it wants to be more critical or mild things, or if you really just want everything, you can do that sort of thing. And so I think the setup is definitely for the fact that critical failures, or if there's strange activity, it kind of has a singular place by which you can kind of see that.
I guess on your security side for your future plans, are you thinking about too? So the login process currently to the Graylog dashboard itself now are all local logins. Do you think about tying that into your Active Directory environment or anything like that?
So one of my lab mates did suggest that there will be something later about LDAP and Active Directory and making sure that things are being signed in with specific accounts. So there was some, we tried to do that somewhere in the middle of the process, and then when we tried to update everything, I mentioned the stuff with OpenSearch and how they had a new version, but they didn't have updated documentation, and when we tried to update everything, then you couldn't get to the web UI anymore, and it turned out there was a couple extra steps you had to do if you were using the latest version. So we decided to wait on that and try to get the project ironed out first.
When it comes to syslog or SIMs, there's two main problems that I've seen. One reason why you're doing it is because you want data. And so not having data is a problem because you can't search it. You know what the other problem is I've seen?
Can't say.
Too much.
Ingesting too much.
And so what I'm curious about is what your thoughts are on getting the right data. Because anybody can collect. You'll run yourself out of storage if you collect all the data you can, and it won't do you any good. It won't be a needle in a haystack. It'll be a molecule in a universe. You won't be able to find anything. So what are your thoughts on collecting the right data?
So that is interesting with parsing information to get exactly what you want. In fact, perhaps I should have included a picture in the input process. There is a section for like certain kinds of particular logs, although it kind of escapes you what particularly they are or how verbose you want those things to be. I believe that is true. You need to parse information, and maybe some of that is things that you need to hold on for. What's the word I'm looking for? For lack of a better term, required reasons. And other things that you need to only hold on for so long that maybe it needs to go, or, you know, determining on what those things are. To be fully honest, I'm not sure which, but I understand that concept, yeah.
Let me give you a term that maybe some of you have heard, maybe you haven't, but since we're talking about this stuff, you're going to want to know it. You ever heard of the word discoverability?
I do want to say I have.
You work for a company, and that company gets served a subpoena, and they say, give us all your records pertaining to X, Y, and Z. If you have it, you got to hand it over. And if you don't, well then you may or may not. Anything that you collect, depending on the kind of organization you work for, can be subpoenaed and can be discovered. And so you have to be very careful about what it is you're collecting. And if you don't have any good reason to collect it and or retain it, probably don't want to.
It's a very valid. There's some reason, and the word you were looking for, I think, is compliance.
That is the word I was looking for.
So,
Thank you.
in this world, what you maintain in your data environment is very critical. Right now, there's a company being sued about the way Pixels, a healthcare organization, the way Pixels work in their internal browsers in their organization. The key here is Because I'm very much, you collect everything, you log everything, and report on what you need. But Chad works in a very compliance and regulated world, very different world where subpoenas occur very regularly. So it's a very, it really depends on where one of you wind up at. But syslogging is very different, but I also work in a world where I don't pay for the storage. My cloud provider pays for the storage and gives me a year of storage, regardless of how much I consume, whereas he has on-premise storage that he pays for by the, by the terabyte, gigabyte. So, very different worlds.
All right. Any other questions? No? Okay.
One quick one.
Okay, sure.
How long do you want this baby of yours to live?
So I think it would be fascinating to take it from a single node, more like proof of concept, into actually getting it secured and having more of a master node and like sort of subordinate nodes. Because during setup there is something about that. And I think it would be interesting to actually expand upon it, do something that's perhaps a little more practical if you were having a larger environment with multiple buildings and levels.
I guess what I'm getting at is, do you want it to survive after this semester?
I guess that's really more up to who comes next, although I wouldn't complain if it did, but if it were to be replaced, if there was something, say, better or more effective, then sure.
As long as you make it accessible to them. I doubt any of you are parents. I know you're not. See? You are?
Yeah.
So you just have a kid and like, oh, did that, and walk away? What do you mean I gotta take care of them? What do you mean there's upkeep? What do you mean there's maintenance? They wanna eat again? That's how I see all my projects. And jobs that I've left, and I had to walk away from something that I worked real hard to get up and going. I did everything I could to make sure that whoever came after me maintained the work that I did. So this is a project, it may or may not last. The reason why I'm telling you this is because as I sit here, I'm thinking about all the previous capstones I've listened to. And everybody, I realize everybody in their mind thinks, oh, I've done that, and now I'm moving on. To me, every project I've done is sort of a child. And my kids would argue that some of them are more important than them, but that's not true. Whatever you do, make sure that whoever follows up, because you may or may not be at that job for a long time, to maintain whatever it is you put your blood, sweat, and tears into. Thank you, Frank.
Of course. Next up, we have Colby with Zabbix. There you go.
Hello, my name is Colby Perkins, and my project this year was to create a network management system. First, I'll answer what that is. So, it's essentially a software that collects, analyzes, and outputs data about the network that centralizes it to make it easier for the administrator to look at important information about their network. The network management system that I chose was Zabbix for a couple of reasons. One, I had done previous research on it before, so I was kind of familiar with kind of the pick and play part of Zabbix and how you don't have to use all of it and more so choose what features you want for your network. I also decided to use Zabbix because it's open source and I like open source programs. It means there's a lot of documentation regarding them. So there was a lot of forums as well as the official documentation that helped me along the way. The goal and scope of my project was to get Zabbix basically working. What this meant pretty much was to get it collecting data and view that data in Zabbix. This was a pretty basic scope. Zabbix can go a lot further than where I took it. But I thought it would be good to just set the goal just to get it started and then finish some extra configuration configuration if possible. These are some extra advantages or features in Zabbix. It includes web monitoring, service monitoring, virtual machine monitoring. You can create reports about your devices and automatic alerting, so you can be notified of any problems that may occur. Initially, when I started out, I chose to install it on Rocky 9.3, which is the most current version of Rocky, so it's the most secure and we get the most updates. I chose Rocky because we had taken a Red Hat course, Red Hat course in a previous semester, so I was more familiar with the command line and moving around on Rocky. Zabbix's first pre-requirement was to set up a local SQL or a local database, and I chose to set that up with MySQL. Once I had a user created, I also created a database after that for the user to access. And then all I had to do was install Zabbix via the command line and start the service and then access the web UI. This was on the first page. These are the prerequisites required in order to install it. So if I had forgotten a step, I would have had to go back and install the correct part. You can see here, it recognizes that it's connected to the SQL database that I configured. This was the main dashboard upon logging in. Well, this was after I had already connected some devices. You can see top CPU utilization, so you can see which are using the most. Host availability, if there are any down, and if any problems have been detected. You can see on the left side there, that's where all of the features and modules are for you to configure. There is a lot of, it's a very deep rabbit hole. You can go into each of those and go into 3 different pages on each of them. The modularity of Zabbix was one of the main selling points of why I chose it. I liked not having to use an entire software and rather starting where I knew I could get something in and go from there. This was one of my web monitoring configurations that I did. It's called a web scenario, and I created each step to monitor the HTTP traffic between the user logging on and the Zabbix server. What it's doing is looking for the session ID, username, and password in order to identify who is logging in into the server. This is a very useful, or this would be very useful in a real-life application, so you could have additional security on every login. Some of the issues I had, initially installing MySQL, I wasn't able to access the shell at all. I think I messed with permissions and locked myself out of it somehow, but I was able, with the help of my instructor, I clean slated my virtual machine and was able to get MySQL installed. The agent on the devices weren't communicating initially. This was something that I had to do specifically on Linux devices, where I installed the agent, which was how the device communicated with the Zabbix server and sent over the information that it was tracking. What I had to do was go into the agent.config file and point it at my Zabbix server. It was initially set to a default value, so the information wasn't going anywhere. And for my web scenario, it's actually getting stuck on the second step of it, when the user is logging in, and it's unable to detect the correct variables. And this is because I'm not well versed enough in the syntax of requesting those variables. Zabbix has a certain syntax that you have to set in the configuration with enough time and research, I do plan to fully correct that web scenario so that it's working correctly. That is my first future plan regarding the Zabbix server. The second is to establish all devices on the server. I only got 2 Linux and 2 Windows machines on it. So that's the first thing that I would like to do is get every device sending data to it. Second is to create triggers and problems, which are more configuration options in Zabbix, which based on those variables, it can trigger something to happen, which is a trigger, or a problem, which is more of an alert that you can configure even more to send alerts or to do other things as well. So I want those to be configured to be more aware of the live network status. And then I want to schedule automatic reports to be sent, and these automatic reports essentially contain the average usage for like CPU and memory utilization, as well as if there were any problems or any recent triggers or configuration options that you can set on Zabbix. They would show up in the report showing you that they happened. Any questions?
Does it work with virtual environments where you can plug the whole virtual host in without having to add each VM separately, or is it one-by-one agent?
It's one-by-one right now. There is virtual machine monitoring, but I wasn't able to get that configured. I attempted, but I couldn't get our entire virtual machine network on there. But that is something that with enough research, I could figure out.
You specifically mentioned you chose the Red Hat spinoff Rocky.
Yes.
I assume you chose a different version of Linux. The reason I ask this is kind of standardization. I think I've heard 2 different versions of Ubuntu already, and now Rocky. So in one project, I'm already hearing 3 different OSs, or at least 2 versions of one OS, and now Red Hat. So complexity is getting there in the project.
Makes
See
it
what I'm
more
saying?
difficult, yeah.
So one of those things. Go ahead.
We were using the same version of
The same version on the
Yes.
side. So we had Ubuntu, so we got 2 different OSs now. So one of the things we might want to, in the future, as a group, this is not an individual comment, it's more of as a group, stick with the same operating system. One, for security purposes, for simplicity purposes, across the project.
I agree. Just patching one version of Ubuntu is, you gotta pay attention to that. And then you gotta have multiple patches, and the patches are installed the same way.
Next we'll bring up Hunter.
Hello, my name is Hunter Womet, and my project is on Radius authentication for network devices. What is Radius, you may ask? Well, Radius stands for Remote Authentication Dial-In User Services. Radius, also for the AA server, is because it does authentication, identifying the user, authorization, gaining access, manipulating their credentials, and accounting for reported usage, such as when they log in, what they're doing, and when they log out. How does it work? For simplicity, think of it as like a bouncer for like a nightclub or something like that. They're checking people's IDs, making sure they say who they say they are. It's pretty much a gatekeep for networking. So the user must provide their credentials, such as whatever their name is, their password, and Radius uses an identifying provider or IDP to see if make sure if that information, password stuff is correct, and if it is correct, they are valid and granted access. Configuring using Windows policy server. What I had to do was install a network policy server by pretty much setting up a network policy server to the Windows machine, registering the Active Directory. I had to integrate the network policy server into the Active Directory domain name, create security groups, how to create some users and groups, and grant them access that are requesting access to network resources. Add a radius client, configure the network policy server to recognize the network devices, create policies that grant or deny access, and add trust certificates. Those certificates secure the communication during authentication. Here you have is our vCenter of me setting up the virtual machine of the NSP server, and going into this virtual machine, I got the network policy server set up right here, and configure the radius client. I got it hooked up to the Capstone wireless network. We got the radius client right here, built ID, and the server right here. Some of the problems I originally ran into when setting this up was I accidentally did not have one of the issues I had was the ISO. I did not have a Windows server. And because of that, once I realized I had all this stuff deleted, I had to delete the entire virtual machine and start from the ground back up. And from one of my recent problems is I have this set up, but I cannot gain access to the radius network, so one of my future plans is to research why that may be, and hopefully have this radius thing all completed before the semester is over. And why did I use Windows? Well, it's most compatible for network policy server, and I have more experience using Windows than I do with Linux. Any questions about radius?
So go back to the ISO. Say
ISO?
again, what would you say happened there? You had the wrong version to start with?
Yeah, so I needed this version, the Windows server, and apparently I did not have that selected. It was built up as a computer, not a server, so I had to destroy the whole thing and start back from the ground scratch up.
Gotcha. I'll ask a question that Pete already asked.
Chuck?
Why? What's the driver of this?
Come again?
The business case.
What's the business case for the purpose of building this radius server?
Pretty much grants access to people who use the server by permitting in their credentials.
Yeah.
Which I'm trying to work on fixing that.
I think you had a great analogy up front. The AAA analogy up front with the bodyguard. It was a good one. But I think radius is a very big enterprise use case.
Yeah.
Alright, I'll pass it on to wireless access points by Jacob.
I've used it quite a lot.
So, my name is Jacob, and my special project was setting up wireless access points. For those who might not know what a wireless access point is, it is a device that hooks up to your main network that allows wireless clients to connect. It may sound similar to a wireless router, but those are more of an all-in-one network solution for homes and small businesses. Meanwhile, access points typically are used more often with larger businesses, as they can be placed around their area and can allow full coverage of that space. So for the immediate setup process, around when the semester began, 4 new access points were ordered, and they arrived later in February. I decided I wanted to mount three total, or 4 total, but for now I mounted 3 in the place of the old devices, which 2 are in the lab and 1 is in the classroom, and I left the fourth one on connected separately so that I could work on a default template to distribute the access points once that is done. And here are here's the two photos of the old and new access points. And the old one is the Aerohive AP650 and the new one is the Ruckus R650. Why did we go with Ruckus? It's because they've been used heavily in a lot of educational scenarios and they were heavily pushed by our vendor, so we decided to go with them. Before I started working on the actual access points, I set up a VLAN to isolate the wireless traffic on our network, and I set them, they were originally supposed to be trunk ports, but I set them to access ports first just to make sure that everything was working fine. And I also began to work on, after that I began to work on the actual access point configurations with basic configurations along with security settings as well. I ran into some problems along the way, if you want to call it that. So with the Capstone network being a mess at the start of the semester, I decided to hold off because trying to add more stuff onto it in my mind was probably not the best, as it would probably add more fuel to the fire when it came to resetting and reconfiguring everything. I couldn't get DHCP to fully work on all devices, mostly because of the other option below that, and not really much else on that. The wireless controller, I wasn't able to fully set that up in vCenter. I forgot to put it on there, but there were some, the software used for the wireless controller had some issues relating to VLANs, and all the documentation I could find really didn't give any kind of way to solve that. And a lot of my problems were also experienced with these enterprise level access points, because the ones I've worked on previously were more simple and may have been for smaller businesses and at home. So what it looked like to me was like the most complex ones I've worked with looked like the most complex options, and the ones I worked with looked like the simplest options for enterprise level. So after all of that, I just decided to go back to the Aerohive access points since the Ruckus software did not want to work. I managed to dig around in there with the help of my instructor and find a previous Capstone configuration template, and I deployed it along with creating a network policy to go along with it, also with the help of my instructor. My future plans are to add the remaining 2 Aerohives to that wireless network and to set up those with the same configurations. I also would like to work with Hunter to finalize the radius setup and exclude Ruckus devices from purchasing options due to their software not being the best and their documentation not being very thorough. Questions or comments about wireless APs?
So, to make sure I'm clear about this, you went back to the old access points because we couldn't get the new devices to work.
Yes.
Okay. What other actions did you go back to the vendor and ask for help?
I did not.
I will say, this is not uncommon, don't get me wrong. I mean, anybody that's worked in this, we bought something that we're told it was gonna be the next greatest thing, and then got it in-house, and it was just, couldn't make it work. So don't think this is gonna be the last time that happens to you. make sure you go back to those people you buy it from and get them to help. Oh, excuse me, my allergies are kicking up.
So, I guess my question is who purchased these?
Believe it was college,
Who?
the college and, was it?
Yeah, college did. So, I'm guessing what is gonna drive that is, so you go work in a business and the board or whoever it may be approves the purchase of this new equipment. You're not gonna be able to go back and say, hey, that didn't work, so they're paperweights now, and, you know, so,
I'm trying not to butt in as the instructor, but to give an explanation, we did forward on your email to our purchase people to get some support from Ruckus. They weren't able to get a response in time. But yeah, we handled the purchasing. Our vendor was like, oh, we sell a ton of Ruckus to education stuff. We can get them really cheap. And the students had all said they hated the Arrow Hives previously, and so we talked a little bit with the semester, and there was like a general agreement to try something else. And so we got a few very cheap on the cheap Ruckus APs. And yeah,
All I was gonna say was, it wasn't you, right?
It wasn't me.
You didn't buy them, you were just
So,
trying to.
so I'm not gonna judge you too critically on it, because you got handed this, although I will tell you, every job I've walked into, I've been handed this, and you're like, why? So, don't be surprised if it does happen to you, it's just part of the game.
the benefit you'd have on an actual job is you have more direct ability to bug the vendor, but where we have to do the support through us, which is the pain in the butt process. It would have been nice if we could have got your email directly on the support, so you could directly call Ruckus, and that would have made things a lot better for you. I'm trying not to butt in as the instructor, but
No, I totally understand.
but
I think
yeah.
I think the lesson here for kind of the class is that this is not an isolated problem to your project. It happens in the real world all the time. It's going to happen. It might happen to you in your first job. You know, you walk in and they hand you widget A and say, hey, go make that thing work. We just bought it.
First rule of a sales job is get the sale, and they don't care if they lie. So I am always fairly critical of vendor salespeople, because they have often told me what they thought I wanted to hear and not the actual truth. So just keep that in mind and treat any salesperson you meet like the garbage they are. Anybody want to be in sales? Hands? That's what I thought.
Any other questions? Okay. Well, next is Tony with GitLab and Next.
Hi, I'm Tony. I set up both the GitLab and Nextcloud servers. They're both completely different projects, but they're both small enough that I decided I would take on both. Part of the setting them both up is that I decided that I would do the same thing across the board for the initial setup. Both Nextcloud and GitLab are using Ubuntu Server 2204. 2204 is not the newest version, it's the most stable version. I've tried the newest version, but it was having problems, with the install on the ISO. It would crash every time. So I just decided I would stick with the most stable version. Part of the initial setup is going into the servers and running the updates, of course. Updating everything just in case the ISO didn't properly install everything properly. It was best practice. I added the servers to the domain, so then that way whenever people need to access these servers to do their projects, because other people needed to access these servers to get the centralized logging or the network management up and working. So I gave them access to those servers, and I gave them admin privileges in the sudo users file. So just so that way everybody had their accounts and everybody was able to access the servers. So why I chose GitLab? For one, GitLab is free, it's open source. We wanted to store our code locally, and we wanted it to sort of, be a repository so everybody could, if other things needed that code, it could use that For example, one other lab member needed it for implementing parts of their project, so just using that was a better way of centralizing the repository. Something neat about GitLab and its GitHub is it stores the changes locally. So if there's ever changes, it keeps the different versions, so if anything goes wrong, you can go back to the previous version. Configuring GitLab, I followed online documentation. The online documentation had some steps that was missing. It didn't really go into great detail. I had to watch some YouTube videos or find other documentation about setting it up. So it did take a bit longer to set that up because it was a bit more of a challenge to find that documentation. After confirming the web page worked, I began to set up LDAP, so then that way people can access these servers, and whenever new people join to our domain, or there's new students coming in, we can create accounts on Active Directory, so in that way we don't have to make new accounts on here. Only problem I had was giving them admin privileges, but in a business network, you would usually go in there manually and assign those admin privileges. Any questions about the GitLab server? Next, we're going to talk about Nextcloud. So there are two main options that I found was Nextcloud and FileCloud. Nextcloud is open source and FileCloud is open source, but what makes Nextcloud different from FileCloud is that Nextcloud is more of an enterprise version. It is more professional looking, the UI looks better, and it's more easier for people to come from other experiences like OneDrive or Google Drive and sort of get the gist of what's going on and how to move around it. I wanted to set it up locally, just so in that way everything's our location. Configure Nextcloud. So Nextcloud recommends that you use Docker to install it. There are other options. You could have it as a snap for Ubuntu, but for simplicity, it's easier to set up it on Docker, and just because all their apps and everything is installed properly through there. Set up Docker first and ran it, the container. I confirmed that the web server worked properly, and next thing I wanted to work on was setting up LDAP. Same thing as GitLab was to make sure that everybody had their accounts set up automatically. One thing I need to finish doing on the Nextcloud server is setting up HTTPS, because when people sign in, their passwords will be seen on the network if it's not encrypted. And I did set that up on the GitLab server, so that is something I needed to get done. It's just setting up the certificate. Any questions for the Nextcloud server?
Did you or the class start using it for any of your storage?
I started storing some of my documentation stuff in there, extra notes and stuff like that, or I started throwing ISOs in there. I'm thinking that we're most likely going to store the presentation in there as well.
And what would your thought be on why a business would use this localized cloud storage versus someone out on the actual cloud?
So for one thing, it's open source, so it's free, of course. And using OneDrive or Google Drive, you can use it for free for a bit, but if you want more storage, you're going to have to pay. So if you can host it locally and you have the hard drives and SSDs to store it stuff, it could be a cheaper option compared to hosting things on the cloud.
Define free for me. Keep hearing how open source is free.
So I did want to mention this, but I kind of forgot to. There are paid options and premium plans for these, but the source code for it, the bare bones of the program is free. So then that way, whenever you're setting stuff up,
So again, define free.
not having to spend any more money than you already have.
So you're saying spending money makes it not free. Is that what I'm hearing? Just before
What would you define as free?
No, no, no. That's not what I'm saying. I've been married a long time. I know when. I'm asking you and anybody else, because I keep hearing about how open source is free, and I'm not arguing one way or the other, but I'm asking you to define what free is. Because at some point, one of you is going to go to your boss and say, I have this free software.
What are the costs of maintaining open source?
Well, so for open source, you would have to go through the online documentation unless you were to pay for the premium stuff, and then you would be able to get to their support teams.
Okay.
Well, what about your time?
Don't I have to pay you to maintain it?
Yeah. Is that free?
No.
So before you go and tell your boss something is free, you need to understand what free is. I had a guy come tell me that he had free software. And I said, okay, well, what does that entail? Well, all I have to do is put in our information. What do we need our information? Well, we just have to sign up the stuff and then it monitors. Well, wait a minute. So they're trading our proprietary, data to give us access to something and they're tracking. So I would ask you, is Gmail free?
Yes, but for the enterprise, you would use, for example, with Gmail, you would have Google Drive.
You were wrong initially. It's not free.
You're giving up your rights to your data and your information in order to get its freemium. That's a really critical point from here.
Doesn't mean
Nothing
it's-
is free.
Doesn't mean it's wrong or right.
Right.
But what I'm trying to get you to understand is free is not really free. Free is here you go, and they walk away. But even then, the documentation or the support or whatever else, just your time alone, your time is not free.
When I give you a free pen that has my logo on it, why am I giving you a free pen with my logo on it?
It would share your brand.
You're walking around with my brand on it all over the city of Manhattan. Coffee cup, phone cases, the whole 9 yards. That's not completely altruistic. That's the same concept with all of the freemium services out there. Gmail, all those things. I think that's the point Chad's trying to get to is open source is great, especially if it's secure, but keeping it secure and keeping it updated has a cost that's involved with it, and that's that maintenance cost and those security features and making sure you can using a syslog server to monitor what's going in and out of it, monitoring, failed login attempts, those types of things.
Anybody know why animals go around in herds?
Safety.
Huh?
Safety.
In numbers. So am I telling you that Microsoft Server 2022 is the best OS in the world? I would never tell you that. But what I will tell you is if you're running it and there's a breach, you're not going to get fired. Why? Because everybody else is running it too. But if you're running some special flavor of Ubuntu or Red Hat, and it's the free version, and there's some undocumented vulnerability, that might get you some attention you don't want. Be very careful with free.
Next we have Kyle for unions.
Thank you, Tom. So, my project, I decided to do something that I knew virtually nothing about going into it. Active Directory, Certificate Services, Certificate Authorities, and YubiKey. So, what does all that mean? That's the first thing that comes to some people's minds. Active Directory Certificate Services is a tool in Windows Server that allows you to create a server certificate authority. Certificate authority acts as a trusted server across your domain so that other servers, other devices are able to go and be like, hey, I don't know what this is, who this is, anything, can you verify them for me? That's what the certificate authority acts as, that trusted source. You can trust me across the network. A YubiKey is a physical hardware device that it's called a hardware token that allows for multi-factor authentication, and in this case, certificate-based multi-factor authentication. So there are a couple of pros and cons to creating, setting up, and using a certificate authority locally. One of the biggest cons is having to have the maintenance and the security team to be able to sit there and make sure no one can have access to this device. If someone were to get access to this device from external sources, they can trust whatever they want on your network. That is the biggest caveat of certificate authority. So it's important to make sure it's locked down. But it makes it so that as long as that device is secure, you're able to connect in more securely. End users are able to not have be forced to remember passwords. You can make it so that your own servers for tools, you're able to log into them and not get an error, hey, this isn't a trusted site. And many other reasons that you would want a local certificate authority. I'm not going to touch base on today. So, smart cards. The smart card type that I use is called PIV, Personal Identity Verification. It's basically a certificate that allows you to assign it to a person, and that certificate is the equivalent of that person. If they put their key in, they put in their PIN, then that computer believes in wholeheartedness that that is that person. You're able to access websites, internal software, anything as that person, given that you have their certificate. Sounds a little insecure, but because of the technology that Microsoft and Yubico, which is the creator of the YubiKeys, as you see over here, because what they've done, the work that they've done, it has been secured. As long as you're able to keep your own local system secure, this will be as well. In order to do this, you have to create two templates on your certificate authority once you have that created. Getting a certificate authority is pretty simple. Install Windows Server, whatever version. I use 2022. I did that because it's easier, I think, easier integration with Active Directory, which we use with Windows Active Directory. Then once you create that, you just add roles, add certificate authority, and boom. Once you get your CA, you must create two templates. One of them is going to be able to, you're able to enroll other people, enroll on behalf of other people. And then the template for the YubiKey setup. I'm not going to get into the nitty-gritty of that. I mostly just followed Yubico's documentation on how to set it up with their tools. Were there any problems upon setting this up? Of course there are. There always are problems. At first I realized that the traditional way of setting the device up as a trusted source, the certificate authority as a trusted source, didn't work. So I did quite a bit of research and found out that the specific version of Windows I was using across the network for the workstations had a glitch in it that made it so that I had to do it through, what was it? Active Directory. No, through policy, that's the word. I had to set a specific key in, oh Lord, that's blanking on. I had to set a specific key in Active Directory in the group policy in order to allow it to be spread across the network. Once I was able to make that certificate authority trusted, I then was able to get it to this point so it could not be used. And that was due to not having the correct drivers installed on the local machine. Once I was able to get the drivers installed, I also used group policy to distribute that across the network, and all things were dandy. Moving forward, there's a lot more I'd like to do with certificate authority part. I want locally trusted certificates for all of the web servers that we created. Make sure that if you're accessing them internally, it won't prompt you, hey, this isn't a trusted source. It will let you right in, and that way if somebody does come from an external source and try to spoof one of your tools, you would know instantly, hey, why isn't this trusted? Let me take a look. I would like to make sure RDP works across the network, any Windows servers that we have. Granted, I'm sure you hear we don't have that many of them, but being able to RDP into your systems is a pretty useful thing. So I was able to get SSH working perfectly fine with Windows machines, but there's a little bit of configuration I'm going to have to do moving forward for our Linux devices. Mainly, it's going to be an Ansible playbook to make that device trusted across the network, and we'll get into Ansible later. Overall, the end goal I would like this to do is create a single sign-on environment for our network, for both the admins and end users. Are there any questions?
So, first, I think you downplay this technology. When the geek triad gets together and agrees to spend money on a technology, I'm sorry, I mean, Microsoft, Google, and Apple get together and collaborate on something, which is the FIDO keys. It's big.
Yeah.
Two, if you evaluate the certificate authority versus buying the certificates and letting someone else manage the certificate, why I ask that, and I get it, you're in a university environment, school environment, you spend a bunch of money, so I get that.
Yeah.
And learning environment. But it's becoming very inexpensive to buy public key infrastructure certificates that run those type of devices these days.
Sure. Number one, if you're concerned about your own security, having your own trusted sources of those certificates might be a peace of mind.
Agreed.
Being able to know, okay, I know exactly how this was signed. I know how to revoke it in case I determine it doesn't need to be enrolled anymore. I know how to do all of that very easily right there. There is a cost difference. This is just maintenance of the machine itself, and again, keeping the security.
Security.
Yeah.
The whole
People, somebody who's knowledgeable about the service. It also depends on how big your network is, right? If you have 1 or 2 systems and 10 users, this might not be worth it for you. This might not be a good solution. But if you got hundreds of users and 30 tools that you use on a daily basis, that is the kind of consideration that you might start thinking towards having your own locally hosted and trusted source.
So you've never come across any of those things before?
Any what things exactly?
Because you mentioned CA, you mentioned.
I've come across them. I hadn't done any deep research into them. I didn't fully understand them. I just knew them as, oh yeah, that's a concept, and moved on.
Didn't I issue you a YubiKey when you joined?
Yes, sir.
So you'd seen one of those before?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So, you now somewhat familiar with CAs?
Yes, sir.
You have your next project. All you gotta do is finish the one I have for you now.
Sucker.
Yep. If I had known that before this class, we'd have talked.
Okay.
Make you some more work.
Hey, I'll take it. Any other questions? Perfect. All right. Next, I would like to hand the floor off to Seth.
Thank you. Hello. How you guys doing? Are you guys all, we're about 3/4 way through. I know it's a long one, but if you guys need to take a quick stretch break or anything, you guys are more than welcome. Give you a few minutes. No? Okay. We're gonna push through. All right. So again, my name is Seth. I'm here with you guys at Capstone. So I'm gonna tell you a little bit about Microsoft CS, Microsoft benchmarks. But before I begin, I'd like to begin with the question for you. Why was the computer cold? Nope. All right, it left his windows open. All right. Today we're going to talk about CS, Microsoft Benchmark. I chose this project because I appreciate security, and I know what it means for me, and I also didn't know what CAS was, and I was curious. So CAS, Microsoft Windows Benchmarks, definition, the best definition I can find is the best practices for the secure configuration recommendations for hardening specific technologies. By hardening, I mean security. It was developed through a unique consensus-based process compromise of cybersecurity professionals and subject matter experts from around the world. So this is a around the world type thing. This is a big deal. I thought this was really cool. It's the only consensus-based best practice security configurations that guides both developed and accepted by government, business, industry, and academia. So it's really cool. And it was also designed as a key component of a comprehensive cybersecurity program. So I want you guys to keep that in mind. That's really cool stuff right there. So moving forward, we have our, this is documentation. What I wanted to show you guys, pre-provided to us as a class. We explored that. It's a really big documentation. It was over 1,200 pages, nearly 1,300. So I can't show you all that. What I can say is a profile is a collection of recommendations for securing the technology or supporting platform. So, and then we also use group policy, which is a feature of the Microsoft Windows family of the operating systems that control the working environment of the user accounts. So, again, the documentation that was provided to us was really big, and probably the first 50 pages they give you an outline of how you utilize it, how you use it. There's so many different things. And then from pretty much page 50 on to like the end of it was list of profiles. And these are the recommendations for configuring your network. So I just want to show you guys. This is a general idea of what a profile looks like. We're going to break it down to help you guys better understand. So I broke it down into 6 sections to help you guys better understand, and we're going to go through it. So our first section is going to be our top one here. So over here you'll find this on the top there. It's going to be our title, our profile, and our description. Your title is your just concise description for the recommendations intended configuration. That's going to be located right there, that line, the top line there. Then you have your profile, which is your collection of recommendations for securing your technology or supporting platform. That's going to be right there. We're going to dive more deep into what that means, because there are certain levels. For our class and our scope, we only cover level 1, which is just standard security. There are higher levels of security though, like level 2 and level 3, which has another name now, starts with P. So it's other levels we do not cover in our scope of class. And then we also have our description, which is our detailed information pertaining to the setting from which the recommendation is concerned. So in every one you'll find profiles with all this information. So moving on, getting more in depth into the level 1, we have our domain controller. Think about this simply as the type of server that processes a request for authentication from within a computer domain. So this is, when someone asks for authentication, they're asking that to the domain controller. These are some steps to follow the domain controllers use. So then you also have your level 1 member services. Member servers contribute to the security of the network. They provide the backbone of services and applications in a domain. The areas that member servers need to protect include user rights, ports, application permissions, services, and local security accounts. I just also talk about member services that have the following roles enabled. Some examples are DHCP server. DHCP stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol. It's a network management protocol used on internet protocol networks for automatically assigning IP addresses and other communication parameters to the network. And then you have your DNS server, which is your domain name server. It provides the phone book, essentially, for the internet. So that's how the internet operates. And then you also have your Hyper-V, which is an administrative tool that allows you to manage Hyper-V hosts and virtual machines, both locally and remotely. And we learned a little bit more about that last semester, but those are some roles that are enabled by member service. These are some examples of level 1 profiles. We have automatically software updates, making sure they're enabled. We have automatically setting the time and date, and basic management controls, including minimum length and character diversity. So, yeah. All right. Are there any questions? All right. So moving on, we have our notes, which is this condensed statement or explanation about the CAS Microsoft Windows benchmarks. Then you have your rationale, which is your detailed reasoning for the recommendation. So explaining further why we want this recommendation, why it's enforced, to provide the user a clear, concise understanding of the importance of the recommendation. So that's coming from this bottom segment here. And then we have our impact and audit statement. The impact statement is any security, functionality, or operational consequence that can result from the following the recommendation. So this is what could happen, just be aware of it. Then you have your audit statement, which is your systematic instructions for determining the target system and making sure that it complies with the recommendation. So, and that goes right there. Almost done. We have our remediation and default statements. Your remediation statement simply is like you can think about it as systematic instructions for applying the recommendations to the target system to making sure it's in compliance according to the recommendation. And then your default value kind of is like what's the default default. So what it's historically been. So. And then last but not least, we have our references. That's kind of site resources, and your CAS controls, which is the critical security controls for effective cybersecurity defense and are the baseline for effective IT risk management. So that's just bottom section here. And I just want to show you guys pictures of what we're doing. So starting off, we have our list of downloading certain documentation that Bree provided us, and then downloading certain, so we can like enable these policies. And we we'll play with our computer using group policy. We were able to do all that, and then the point was we were able to configure our security settings. And so these are manually configuring these. So in conclusion, each organization is different and may use all or a mixture of profiles to secure their environment. CAS benchmarks serve as a framework for security, and it's important to keep the network hard or more secure. Speaking about security, wasn't it hard to crack Forrest Gump's password? 141? All right, with that, I'll look up for any questions. You guys have?
So, when you get into GRC, Microsoft's tool for servers is great. Where else did you implement CIS controls in the project?
That was a big lab component for us. We really took some labs and wanted to further analyze that. So I don't know if we can apply that into our network per se, but it was, as far as our labs were concerned, it was probably our biggest project for our lab. It was validated at most points. So
Yeah, see, the reason I ask that is because, you might have set, remembering the last 24 passwords or a length of your password or complexity of your password on the Windows server, that's great. But then your switch is ABC123 as a password.
Yeah.
You know, so you've implemented that CIS control on the server, but then I can break into your switch. You know, so that's the only reason I asked that question. Again, a lot of the questions, you guys are about to graduate, you know, so a lot of the questions are kind of project level questions this year.
Yes, sir.
Because you obviously learned from our questions last year, and your projects are reflecting that. But you gotta think about those things, as these CIS controls are not isolated to the servers, you know, they kind of span your environments now. When you walk into that first job, or for those that are already working there, you might have seen this. It isn't just how I log in each day, or how I log in with my admin account, or my admin account provides me access to other things. It's all of those environments that we have to make sure we're controlling that access to with those governance risk and compliance standards.
Yes, sir.
How much of the document did you get implemented?
I spent like because the network was down, we weren't able to get into group policy, implement those. But manually, I spent a couple hours, a couple of days, and was able to manually do those. And then we were trying to get things rock and rolling for you guys. We're going to eventually get those all configured using starter kits and whatnot. So.
GRC work can be very deep.
Yeah, it was really cool.
As you can tell.
Yeah, it's amazing. We just configured a lot of the security settings, so it's all we had a chance to cover. But
Don't lock yourself out.
yeah,
That's all I can say. Done it before.
awesome. Any more questions? We good? Okay. With that, I'll bring up Suki Card to talk about Ansible automation.
Alright, hello, my name is Sophia Carr, and today I will be talking to you about Ansible automation. Now, you may be asking yourself, what in the world is Ansible? Ansible is a language that is primarily used for automation and infrastructure as a service. Ansible primarily uses playbooks, which is a very small example, and they declare a state using a series of commands to accomplish a task. And with this example that I have here, one of the primary introductory commands that you use for any type of programming language is to use hello world. And simply what this playbook is doing now is that it'll simply print out within the command line, hello world. So it's just a nice little greeting to you every time you log in. And it's just a good way to get familiar with the syntax and the different types of structures with how Ansible is created. All right, automation. Why is automation important? Automation is important because it produces consistent results, it can increase efficiency over time, and you're able to mass deploy configurations to clients. And I primarily chose Ansible because YAML, which is the primary language that Ansible is in, their syntax is easy to read, and they have very extensive documentation for different types of integrations and the different types of networking devices that Ansible uses. So I primarily use the documentation for my project here. And because automation, we don't really have a lot of scope within this program, I thought it would be very challenging with the least amount of experience, so I would be able to get the most out of this project. All right, Ansible Tower Platform. So we primarily use Ansible Tower, and we were originally going to use Red Hat Automation Platform, which a couple of my classmates have mentioned we did take a Red Hat Linux course, but unfortunately, due to the financial burden and licensings of Red Hat Automation Platform, we had to use a different type of platform for our automation purposes. And this came in the form of Ansible Tower, which is also known as AWX. AWX is an acronym for Ansible Web Executable. And as you can see here, I was able to create an inventory to sync our VMware and our ESXi host, which you see here is the different types of servers that my classmates have created with here. And another good feature about AWX is that we're able to push out different types of jobs, which we are able to sync with our GitLab server, which I will get into here in a few minutes. But we're also able to have different types of credentials, and it's a good way to organize all of our hosts without actually logging into the virtual network itself. Okay. Our favorite word, Ansible and compliance. So for the second part of my project, which I believe was also a previous question asked, was why compliance? Why is it important? And what are some other ways that we implemented the CIS controls? So part of the second part of my project was that I used OpenSCAP, which is primarily for Linux distributions and ensuring that our Linux workstations and our Linux servers are in compliance. And that came in the form of OpenSCAP. And one of the benefits of OpenSCAT is that it's easy to audit compliance policies, and that not only can it use NIST compliance, but it can also use PCI, CIS, and among others. And for what you're seeing here is the CIS. So this was after I ran a remediation playbook on one of our servers as an example. And you can see we were able to pass 66 of these CIS controls, and we only failed 9. And this is a pretty good 87% rate, which, as we know in the GRC world, it's nearly impossible to get 100% compliance. So 87% is relatively high, even for school standards. All right, and some of the screenshots that you see here is the different types of CIS controls that the remediation playbook was able to produce, and I was able to run on my personal Fedora workstation. And as you can see, it's just checking for the different config files, checking for the SSHD, which Kyle previously mentioned that in the future I would like to use Ansible and to create a playbook to generate different types of SSH configurations and push those out to the different servers, as we saw previously, that was connected to our VMware host. And this is more in detail about the specific CIS controls that were able to pass and to fail. Okay, and the final part of my project was to create a Cisco playbook. Now, what you see here is a playbook that I created to run on one of our many Cisco switches. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to run it, but what I would like to do for the future is to use more of the AWX platform to run it and to test it on some virtual switches. And as you see here, I have a password. Now this is just a sample password. Don't want anyone, logging into the switch as Capstone admin. But this is a good way to aggregate your passwords and have a good password rotation, as we know it's beneficial to kind of keep those hackers on their toes, making sure you're not just committed to one password. Although, depending on who you ask, some people would say you would want more longer secure password. Now, we did have some issues with implementing Tower. So just some additional context for AWX is that I was not able to actually set up the server. Thankfully my instructor was able to do it, as it does require a lot of different technologies that we are not familiar with and that are way out of scope, such as Kubernetes and Amazon Web Services. So I believe Chad has previously mentioned that nothing is really free in this world, and this is a good example of how, even though this may not cost anything financially, but it did cost a lot of upfront time. And this specific error that I had in this screenshot was we were able to try to connect to our GitLab server, which is created from a different student, but for some reason the credentials were not syncing correctly, so unfortunately I was not able to run that remediation playbook on our other Linux servers. Any questions about Ansible?
Did you look into setting up playbooks for patch management as well?
Yes, thank you. I was going to touch on that. So another benefit of Ansible that we could use to continue the longevity of this project is to create an Ansible playbook that's able to install and pull different patches, just depending on the different server, and to push them out to our VMs.
Is this, I think the business value here is, does this create recoverability over terms, over school years, so as you guys depart, the next class comes in along with the documentation, and is this gonna help bring that to fruition, or if you guys think this is going to actually help next year or the next session?
And of course that definitely depends on just the type of people that come in with this next cohort. Although I would like to say that Ansible is just the greatest thing and that, they would be able to use Ansible for other patch management, but we all know that's not realistic. They may find a different type of patch management. They may have a different type of language that they want to use, not necessarily Ansible. They might use a different program like Python, and just kind of depending on what the next cohort wants to specialize in.
Seems to me you chose an incredibly difficult project, one that was outside of your comfort zone and abilities. Is that true?
Yes, that's very true.
Why?
So I'm always eager to learn new things, and I was also more interested in the compliance piece, as I do a lot of compliance work for my job. As many of you know, I do work for Pete. I am his help desk, so we do have I do have a lot of compliance experience, but I also kind of wanted to see, how can I automate this? How can I make these controls go into a place without me having to manually go, okay, this needs to have a 24-character password, and going through each and every CIS control. So I thought this would be a good way to, maybe something I could apply for my actual job, or if not in this current role, maybe roll it forward into a future one.
So you were willing to take on something and present it, even though the risk was to fall on your face in front of all of us.
That was my fear. In some ways I definitely do think, I was like, here's my project. But I think it was a really good learning experience. And,
You realize how lucky you are to hire her?
I know every day. Trust me.
That's a
And
rare quality.
broadcast it to the world every day.
That's a rare quality.
Thank you. But
Because most people are limited by their fear, and they will not get outside their comfort zone. So, I would not see anything in this as being unsuccessful or a failure, because you learned more out of that than you probably ever imagined.
That's a point that I will say, I planned on saying at the end. You are going to fail, but that's part of this journey you're gonna go on. I make mistakes, ask Sophie, I make mistakes. And I've been doing this for 35 years. You're gonna make mistakes. Learn from your mistakes and don't make the same mistake twice. But go out there and challenge yourself. To do the hard things is what will make you successful, all of you. And yes, I am very lucky.
all right, any other questions? All right, next, last but not least, we'll have Isaiah.
Before I get started, I just want to thank everybody for their patience. I know that took up the majority of your afternoon, and a lot of people are busy. My name's Isaiah, and my special project was the request tracker ticketing system. As everybody knows, you can't spell tickets without IT. Okay. There were 5 main components in going into the web server, or not the web server, but the ticketing system. Apache 2 web server, MariaDB and MySQL used for database, the Perl module, the dependencies, and then the actual ticketing system itself. First things first came the Apache 2, which I use for my web server. I found a lot of good documentation on Request Tracker. I used Ubuntu 22.04 as my operating system. First things first, it recommended Apache 2 by default. And within that, didn't require a whole lot of configuration, but as you can see on screen here, there is one of the configs for Apache 2. This dealt with error logging, debugging, and general logging itself. Next became MariaDB and MySQL. This was for the database. I know I touched in the configuration slide of the secure install of MySQL, and this required a little more configuration. Here's the secure install of MySQL. It wasn't recommended, but in a production environment, it said things like this, removing anonymous users, logging in remotely, and when you install MySQL, it comes with a test server, and that was recommended to be disabled as well. And then here is the configuration for MariaDB. Basically took my local user and my server and matched it up with the login for my ticketing system. Next is the Pro module. This one, again, didn't require a whole lot of configuration. I'm not very familiar with the Pro module. It's a fairly older, by my standards, older software. But
this is going to lead to some interesting questions.
yeah, I think.
He
But
told you
this
old.
was used to format the libraries of Request Tracker, as well as HTML. Bird module was initially installed, but like I said, didn't require much configuration. Next was the dependencies for Request Tracker. This by far took the longest for the install. Once you run, I think it's make test deps, you get this screen. All these are missing, and it goes on for another 20 lines, and then you have to fix the deps that are missing. This is just an example of what that looks like. This process took anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half. So I know one of the times when I did it, I made dinner, and then I booted up my favorite Netflix show or something like that. But then once all of them checked well, I was able to get into the Request Tracker service itself. And with that comes different versions. I ran into a problem with the dependencies on the previous slide with the most recent version of Request Tracker, which is 5.5. I rolled back to 5.0.1 for my project. And within that is the config file. And what's cool about Request Tracker is you can basically run the whole ticketing system in the command line of Linux. There are different web configurations, email configurations, stuff like that. You can all do that from this config file here. And then once I got it up and running, as you can see, there's no tickets there because things are working as they should. But in the future, I would like to pass this down to different classes as they could use this for tracking of Capstone projects or if things go wrong with the network. Any questions? I went through relatively quickly, but.
So I'll leave the Perl module to Chad. One thing I would have, kind of a general statement, what I'd like to have seen, there's lots of ticketing systems out there, so the tool you used wasn't as much of a question to me as how you'd have set it up in the end state, level 1, level 2, level 3, what are the, even, Sophia can talk all day about how I've switched from one system to the next. We just switched in January to a new ticketing system, and we're still trying to get the queues straightened out.
That's right.
So how you set those things up are critical to the structure. So I think you'd have learned a lot had you worked on setting up queues for the different things you're doing in your environment. And maybe even integrating that with some of the other projects and had the time allowed for that, something like that. But I think there's something to be said for setting up those queues in a ticketing system.
I didn't see any like notification portion of it, like did it?
On here?
Yeah, I mean, that looks like a web UI, which is fine, but if somebody sends an email, will it create a ticket, an alert?
Yeah, that was one of the things. So we don't have a Capstone email, and that was something I would like to input into here. Because I don't, like I said, if this goes to a future project, I don't want my email on there, my school email. because, 5 years from now, if I get an email from Request Tracker, I'm not, gonna know what to do with it. So definitely, am not done with this. Would like to, there's tons of integrations and stuff I'd like to use.
The other thing, to me, I stress it hard because I'm in the banking world and I live and die by audits, is patching. There's lots of applications out here, but I haven't really heard of anybody talking about, unless I ask, about how are you gonna patch this exactly? What does that require? Because that's part of the upkeep. Heat's not wrong, it'd be nice to see some categories, some sort of, real user tickets in there.
Gotcha. Any other questions? Okay, with that, I'd like to bring up my classmates for any final questions.
So when you get to this slide, this is where I kind of want to go back to the patching overall. You're about to graduate. I think the vast majority of you, several of you I know, are working in some role in technology. So you have an idea of what is out there with the patching and the cyber and the compliance and the GRC that's out there. I would have liked to see a little bit more about that side of the house. Hey, we have this overarching plan on the project to make sure all of the systems are up to date via this. And you went down that road, which was great. And it's very difficult when you're taking on a project, something that difficult. All in all, I will say, those of you last year that heard from me and maybe talked on the side about confidence and standing up in front of people, the number one thing you could do, I said last year, was get that confidence of talking in front of people, because the number one skill that's gonna do you well is to be able to get in front of people and speak. Bravo, all of you did very well this year. So good on you for everyone that spoke to me one-on-one last year, or we talked about it in front of the group. Good job. I'm really impressed about that. Some of you might have a little bit more room to improve. Keep working on it. But you did really great compared to last year for those that I spoke to about that last year. Again, the patching thing, bosses like Chad and I and Josh, we're gonna understand the geek speak. You'll see right on my website, it says, no geek speak here. Why? Because the people that hire us, or people that hire Chad or Josh, they don't understand the geek speak. A couple of you are very good at getting rid of the techno jargon. Everybody needs to work, I need to work on that every day. Because those above you, and that's why I kept asking about what's the business case, what's the value to the business? Hey, I want you to spend $100,000 on widget A. Why should, as a business owner, why should I spend $100,000 on widget A? Is it gonna bring me more money? Is it gonna make my employees safer? Is it gonna make my employees happier? Is it gonna make my customers happier? Is it gonna make them safer? What is that use case? When you're going into briefing, even a technology, make sure you're talking to why, and not, well, because it's this great tech tool. It's the latest and greatest thing. There are a lot of new things out there every day. So and this is, I think, more for the program, and I think where it's growing, but I'd love to see a lot more on cybersecurity and IT sec and kind of an overarching on the project. I think all of these pieces go together very well, but I think overarching project, there should have been that focus on the patching, the cybersecurity, the GRC, the compliance. That's what everybody's talking about out there. The threat vectors in Kansas are crazy. K-State recently hacked Kansas State courts. We've been called out, my company's been called out to 3 or 4 in the last 3 or 4 months right here in town. So, and really, some really stupid ones. So it's changing even in flyover country here. changing significantly in the last 12 months.
Yeah, I don't disagree. In my career, I've seen security become initially an afterthought to now it should be. And you know, some of you had talked about developing and stuff, which is fine. In the old days, developers didn't care about security; that was somebody else's job. At this point, no matter what part of the industry you get into, it's all your job. And Kyle will tell you that nothing gets done without that aspect, you know, eyeballed. And if something gets brought to me, the first thing I'm going to ask is, okay, well, how do we maintain this? Because you might get a job for a bank or some other regulated industry. Oil and gas is very regulated. I've worked for a defense contractor. Also, as you might imagine, tight security.
And getting worse.
Yes. Bad guys seemingly don't get better if you're nicer to them. So, you know, whatever you do going forward, that should be a main priority, everything that you do. I agree with Pete. The presentations this year, I thought, as a whole, were better. You guys presented yourself well.